Thank you very much for joining today's Spring and Severe Weather Outlook webinar. I'm your host, Stephen Strum, and with me today are Jeff Johnson and Nate Hamblin. First off, we'll start with a few introductions. Jeff Johnson is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin at Madison and attained the designation of Certified Consulting Meteorologist from the American Meteorological Society in 1993. Jeff has been with DTN for nearly 40 years and currently specializes in long-range and seasonal forecasting for the energy, agricultural, and transportation client groups. Nate Hamblin is the long-range team lead meteorologist for DTN, and Nate specializes in mid-range, long-range, and seasonal forecasting for various industries, including energy, agricultural, transportation, construction, and more. Nate has over 16 years of operational forecasting experience, and he has a BS in meteorology from the State University of New York at Oswego. As for myself, I'm a graduate of Penn State University and obtained an MS in meteorology from the University of Oklahoma. I've been forecasting weather for the energy and trading industries for over 20 years and also taught economic meteorology at the Oklahoma State University in Tulsa from 2003 to 2009. I'm currently the VP of Extended Forecast Services here at DTN. And with that, I think we can get started. Our first speaker today is Jeff Johnson, who will be taking a look at what we saw back in spring 2019, along with some other climate and trend information. Jeff, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Stephen. Appreciate that, and welcome everybody. We've got a full complement of information here to go through today, and what I'd like to do, first of all, is give you a rundown of our topics for the day. I'm going to start out with a review of what spring was like last year, just to put a little bit of a starting point perspective on the weather pattern, look at some recent trends back into the late winter and early spring season so far, and then just a few slides to talk about the COVID-19 issue and the relationship to temperatures and seasonality. And then pass the control over to Nate Hamblin, and he'll go over the forecast process and what we're looking for the upcoming few months. And then we'll summarize all this back with Stephen, and he'll specifically talk about some spring forecast issues that we see this time of the year and try to bring some perspective on the impacts that we're expecting for the next few months. So first of all, starting off with a review of last spring, March to May of 2019, the temperatures on the left, if you remember, was a pretty chilly spring across the central part of the country, while the southeastern quarter of the nation did enjoy some very mild conditions. Precipitation was quite dry in that southeast chunk of the country, but very wet in the midsection. And looking at those monthly temperature departures, in March we had some very cold weather that continued to bring winter chill across the north central United States. Only Florida and parts of Arizona and New Mexico saw above average temperatures in March. Then during April, the pattern began to warm up. It looked like spring was coming across a good part of the country, although it still was chilly in the upper Midwest and a little bit cooler than normal in southeast Texas and Louisiana. But then in May, below normal temperatures came in with abandon once again from the southwestern corner of the country into the upper Midwest. But that southeast part of the country really warmed up, very warm summer-like temperatures during the month of May in that area. So a lot of changes took place last spring in terms of temperatures. And then on the precipitation side, March started out drier than normal, as indicated by the yellow and orange shades there, especially in the southeastern and northeastern part of the country, as well as the Pacific Northwest. And then in April, it got a little bit wetter, especially in the lower Mississippi Valley region into Texas, and then also a little bit wetter than normal east of the Mississippi. And then in May, the pattern really got wet, very heavy precipitation from Texas northward through the Central Plains, Midwest, and that late spring rainfall fell into the Mississippi River Basin and continued the flood threat that developed further north earlier in the year. So it was kind of a bad situation the way that heavy rain came in later in the year, slowing down or continuing to fill in the rivers. and we'll have a lot more information about the flooding for this year coming up a little bit later. Snowfall in the latter part of the winter and early spring last year, the March through May snowfall accumulation. That map on the left shows a good amount of snow fell from the mountains of Colorado northeastward, especially into South Dakota and Minnesota. The map on the right, the green shades show snowfall relative to normal, so a lot of above average amounts in the northern plains region. So again, we had a late season heavy snowfall that occurred and built up the snow cover, which was very slow to melt during the spring of last year. Severe weather started off somewhat active during the month of March in Texas, eastward through the southeastern part of the country, and then in April it really blossomed across the southeastern and mid-Atlantic part of the country, and then May, virtually the southeastern quarter of the country saw numerous severe weather reports. In terms of what you're looking at on these maps, the red dots indicate tornado locations. The blue dots indicate strong or severe wind gusts, and the green dots represent large hail. So started out in March where it normally does, and then began a northward progression, but quite a bit of it did occur in the eastern part of the country during April as well as May. And just to put it in perspective on how active the severe weather was last year, we have these graphs showing roughly the last 10 years or so of tornado counts across the country during the January through December period. 2019 is the dark black line kind of in the center of the graphic, and the lower plots on there represent the most of the previous 10 or 12 years, and the dotted line in there represents the average. So 2019 was above a lot of the recent years in terms of tornado counts, and it was also much more active than average, as well as most of the more recent years. It wasn't quite as active, though, as those top two lines, which were 2008 and 2011. Those were La Nina springs. That's when we tend to see a lot more tornadoes. So the pattern was pretty close to one of those bad La Nina years. And a lot of that relationship was due to the way the temperatures were lined up last spring. That little map in the upper right part of the slide shows cold temperatures in the northwest half of the country and warmth in the southeast. And typically, when we have that strong temperature gradient between the cold and the warm, we have an active jet stream and storm track, which is conducive for producing large amounts of severe weather. So that particular layout of the temperature structure last spring was real similar to what we see during La Nina years. So that'll be real important when we look forward to this year's conditions as well. Now, in terms of recent weather, the last 3 months, the temperature plots on the top show January, February, and March. And the main signal that shows up is we have had pretty warm conditions here since the start of 2020. Even going back into December, it was quite warm. We had a little break in the action in the central part of the country in February, where temperatures were a little closer to normal. But in March, it's really warmed up again for the central and eastern part of the nation. Rainfall-wise, for January, a big bullseye of above normal precipitation in the mid-Mississippi Valley region, as well as the northwest part of the country. And then in February, it was quite wet in the southeast. And now here in March, we've seen a shift northward of the heavier precipitation, generally the Tennessee and Ohio Valley into the mid-Mississippi Valley region, as well as into western Texas. But surrounding those areas, we have seen below average precipitation shown in the orange shades. In terms of the heating demand over the winter, there was less than average heating demand. The chart on the left shows most of the country had lower heating degree days than normal. especially the eastern half of the country, so a lot less energy usage. And then compared to last year, the chart on the right shows again less heating degree days for this winter compared to the previous winter. So we definitely did experience a much milder winter compared to normal. In terms of the snowfall we have for the season up to date, the map on the left shows the total accumulation. A little bit easier to see relative to normal with the map on the right. The yellow shades indicate below average snowfall, which was pretty much the rule in the northeastern part of the country, and that was primarily due to all that warm weather during the heart of the winter season, December, January, and March, with those really well above average temperatures resulted in more rainfall rather than snow occurring. But above average snow, pretty much the rule across the northern and central Rockies, through the northern plains, and into the upper Mississippi Valley region. Currently, the snow cover map on the left does show that there isn't too much snowpack left across most of the United States. Obviously, the mountains of the west still have very deep snow cover, but really we're just looking at eastern North Dakota, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, upper Michigan, and then portions of eastern New York through interior central and northern New England is where the remaining snow cover is. And compared to normal on the right map, the blues indicate above average snow cover for the state, whereas the yellow shades represent less snow on the ground for this particular date. So the snow is melting quicker than normal for a good part of the country. Now, just to try to bring some perspective on the virus situation with COVID-19, there has been some work done in terms of trying to relate these viruses and epidemics to weather. And a lot of this research really is preliminary and nothing finalized on this yet, but there is some suggestion that the virus tends to spread most efficiently between temperatures between 5 and 11 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 41 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, and also lower levels of humidity. So that doesn't mean that the virus exists in temperatures outside that range, but some of these preliminary studies just find that it's most efficient in that roughly 40 to 50 degree temperature range. As we move into warmer environments, there's some tendency for the spread to decrease. So there is some talk and hope that conditions will improve with warmer season and greater humidity levels coming in. But on the other hand, there has been virus spreading in areas outside this favorable temperature range. So this doesn't mean that this is going to go away because summer is coming. The virus is still present in areas that are experiencing warm and humid conditions, such as Singapore and the Philippines, as well as parts of the southern hemisphere. And also of note is the southern hemisphere will be going into their winter season as we move into the summer season, so that'll keep the virus active in that part of the globe. So the most likely scenario, if weather does have any influence at all, is that there should be some lull that will develop as we move later into the spring season and summer, but likely would return in the fall as those temperatures do come back. So just to try to put a global picture on this, the map on the left shows the areas which do have the greatest number of reports of infection. So it's pretty widespread across the United States, large parts of Europe, and then into the China region. And just relating that to that one study that shows the favored temperature range, the map on the right shows average temperatures for the month of March, and that favorable temperature range between roughly 41 and 51 degrees is that green shading. And if you look on that global map, you can see that favorable range does run across roughly the central United States and then widespread portions of Europe. And then as we get into eastern sections of China, temperatures have been in that favorable band during the month of March, whereas other parts of the globe, the southern hemisphere as well as Africa and India, have average temperatures during the month of March well above that temperature range. But again, flipping back to the map on the left, you can see that there are reports of the virus just about anywhere, but they do seem to be more concentrated in that area of favorable temperatures between roughly 40 and 50 degrees. So just what does that mean in terms of the months ahead? Well, these are average temperatures for April, May, and June. And again, just focusing on that green shading for ballpark locations. You can see that during the month of April, average temperatures across the northern U.S. are still in that favorable range. So it would suggest temperatures would continue to be favorable. Also, parts of Europe would also be still in that favorable range as we move into May. You can see that those green shades move further north up into Canada, Alaska, the mountains, the Rocky Mountains still have average temperatures in the 40 to low 50 degree range. And then by June, that favorable range does move further north, but still would impact areas of northern Canada, parts of the Rocky Mountain region, and areas up toward Iceland. And then as the winter season develops in the southern hemisphere, you can see how southern Australia, South Africa, and the southern parts of South America start to get into that favorable region. So not trying to make any forecasts of the virus here, but just trying to show you how weather patterns could influence that based on some recent studies. If we do have really warm temperatures or really cold temperatures, this is the official word from the World Health Organization, the United Nations organization, and they do say that from evidence so far that the virus can be transmitted in all areas, including those with hot and humid weather, as well as really cold conditions don't necessarily kill it. So again, this just kind of reinforces that the virus doesn't necessarily go away because of weather, but that previous study just shows where the more favorable regions for spread would tend to be. So hopefully we do have favorable conditions that do develop here in the months ahead, and I'd like to now pass it over to Nate, who's going to look at forecast process and what we're thinking here for the next several months. So, Nate, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for the very great information regarding what has happened and the effect of the virus. And it'll be great to have in the back of your mind as we go through the forecast process here. The main seasonal drivers, let's take a look at what's going to influence the forecast over the next 3 months. And everything that we're looking at is neutral, which makes it a little bit more difficult. But if you look at the tropical Pacific, where the Ensemble region is, you don't have a La Nina nor an El Nino going on. And the reason why is because you have some cool water off the coast of South America balanced by some warmer water in the Central Pacific. You see warmth across most of the North Pacific. In the PDO, which is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, depends on differences in temperature, and there really are none. So even though there's all that warmth up there, there's basically a neutral PDO because of that. Looking at the Atlantic, it's more or less a balance of the cooler North Atlantic waters versus the warmer Central Atlantic waters. So for the next 3 months, there's not a whole lot to lean on when it comes to seasonal drivers. But we're going to look at years that have the closest configuration to this when we derive our analogs. And let's take a look at ENSO itself from modeling centers all across the world. And right now we are kind of on the warmer end of the neutral spectrum, but there's a pretty good model agreement that these temperatures will cool as we get towards the heart and especially the latter part of spring, a little bit more into the neutral category. So pretty high confidence of neutral ENSO. As we go towards the summer, it cools further, but at least for the spring here, we're going to keep the cooler or keep the neutral thing going. there are a couple of outlying models that do go into the La Nina camp even by the time we get to late spring. The odds of that are very low at this time. So, based on that information, we're going to take a look at analogs. So basically, we're taking a look at the past with similar ocean temperature patterns and seeing how they behave. It kind of gives you a clue as to what is coming. And the years that we chose do show the slowly declining ENSO as through the spring and into the summer. So we picked 10 years that look pretty similar to what's going on. Some differences to account for some variability. And let's go right to it. In April, the temperatures on the left, precipitation on the right, the yellows mean below normal temperatures and below normal precipitation. The blues and greens mean above normal temperatures and precipitation. And what we see is warmth across the western U.S. and northern U.S. and coolness in the south. And precipitation-wise, below normal precipitation in the central U.S. with a particular focus on the middle and upper Mississippi Valley and northern plains with wetter than normal conditions along the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. For May, kind of flip the script a little bit, and we go with cooler than normal temperatures in the west and the north with warmth pretty much pressed down into the south. But you see a wetter pattern spread further into the central U.S., so it does also include the mid-Atlantic and southeast, but it expands into at least the upper Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and the middle Mississippi Valley. So a wetter pattern does look to emerge as we get later in the spring. The Pacific Northwest does look wet as well. And looking at June, we do see an expansion of warmth getting into the plains and the interior west with some coolness that sets up across the Ohio Valley into the northeast. Very modest in nature. Precipitation, you see a little bit of a drier signal for the southern plains through the middle Mississippi Valley, Ohio Valley, and into the northeast, but wetness still lingers along the Gulf Coast, especially the eastern Gulf Coast, and the upper Midwest. Adding it all up, and these types of things do tend to occur with neutral signals. The signals tend to balance themselves out over a large period of time. And the best chance of warmth over a 3-month period from the analogs will be across the interior southwest with more of a neutral signal as you go further east. Precipitation-wise, a wetter signal firmly in place from the mid-Atlantic down through the southeast coast, wetter across portions of the upper Midwest, but a drier signal from basically the central and southern plains and the northern high plains, northern Rockies. Mixed signal in the northeast. So now that we know what the analogs are doing, let's compare that to the seasonal weather models and see what kind of agreement or disagreement shows up. So let's take a look at the next few weeks first here, and we're going to take a look at the European model. In week 1 and week 2, it does show a very warm signal. We've seen a lot of that lately, and that's not going to change at least through the first week of April. Above normal temperatures for the central and eastern U.S. and below normal in the west. But the thing you notice by week 2 is that warmer signal does start to even creep into the west, and that kind of springboards into the next few weeks. So week 3 and week 4, ending the 12th and the 19th of April, you start to notice some coolness spreading into the central U.S. and even into the Great Lakes and Northeast to a certain extent. So the warmth gets pressed down into the Gulf Coast and the Mid-Atlantic region. So a pattern change is possible if the model guidance is correct. And precipitation, a very wet pattern from the Ohio and Tennessee valleys into the northeast for week 1. But week 2, we tend to dry things out in the north and west, keeping the precipitation pinned down closer to the Gulf Coast. Week 3 and week 4, you start to see the precipitation fight back north just a little bit, but it does still stay in the southern plains down through the Gulf Coast for the most part. The drier signal in the north does start to take over a little bit, and that is certainly noted in our forecast as we go forward. Well, let's expand that out for the next few months. And the CFS V2 model does also show the risk of below normal temperatures in April for the central plains, northern Rockies, and into the west. It does keep warmth pinned down into the Gulf Coast, and then, of course, into the northeast. And then May, you start to see a comeback of the warmth with central and eastern U.S. basically warm, west coast as well, and any kind of coolness is more pinned into the Rockies region, high plains. And then June, not much different. So central U.S., weakness in the warmth, but surrounded by warmth otherwise. Precipitation, keeping anomalies pinned down into the southeast and even in the portions of Texas, but expansion of the wetness does come back, kind of like the analogs show, for May and even into portions of June. So increasing the wet pattern for a lot of places in the central and eastern U.S. as we get later in the spring. Not much of a signal in the west. And we'll take a look at the North American Multi-Model Ensemble. And these folks over the IRI recalibrated this. In other words, they did some bias correction to get rid of some long-standing biases that this model shows. And these are chances of temperature either being above or below normal. The reds on the left show above normal. There are not very many blues, if any, on there. But it does show a weakness April, May, and June in that central U.S., northern Rockies region, with warmth in the southwest and the east part of the U.S. In precipitation, you see kind of a hodgepodge where the yellows are better chances for below normal, the greens are better chances for above normal precipitation. And from the middle Mississippi Valley into the Ohio Valley, you do see those chances. They're not very strong, but the signal is there, and some of the dryness is more or less out west. And the European model will weigh in as well, and it weighs in quite warm. April and May, basically above normal across the country for temperatures. And for June, it does show a little bit more of a weakness with association of its wetter forecast in portions of the south, central, and southeast. Precipitation does not have much of a signal in April, maybe a touch dry closer to the western Gulf Coast. But in May and June, you start to see the expansion of wet anomalies across the southeastern quarter of the country. And one thing we're going to have to watch, especially this year with all of the large-scale factors, neutral or subseasonal factors, such as the polar vortex. Well, we're getting to the time of year where the influence diminishes as we get, especially as we get into April and May. Most of the time that disappears. But anything that happens up there can still have at least a small impact on the pattern going forward. And tropical thunderstorm clusters in the Pacific, the MJO, as you might have heard before, and what this does is where these thunderstorms tend to congregate in the tropics, it adds a bunch of heat and momentum and sends it northward into the jet stream. And when that happens, you tend to get north and south jet stream fluctuations, which ridges and troughs will build. So warmth will go certain places and coolness will go different places, and that pattern can become blocked up if the event is strong and unique. So those things can cause some different temperature and precipitation patterns on shorter timescales, let's say 2 to 3 weeks. And soil moisture can also have an impact on temperatures. If you have dry soil everywhere, you'll have higher max temperatures during the day. But if you have wetter soils, it tends to hold it down as more of the sun's energy will go into evaporating the water. So, taking all that into consideration, let's do a high-level spring and summer outlook for the U.S. And first of all, our forecast process. We start with a 30-year climatology from 1981 to 2010, and we average in a weighted average of 10-year trends of what has happened, will continue to happen, the analogs we spoke about earlier, and the seasonal model guidance. So we weigh all that together, and that's how we come up with our final forecast solution. So let's take a look at the temperature outlook for April through June. And first things first, we're going to notice something a little bit different in April that we've seen lately. We should see some below normal temperatures pop up somewhere. And the best chance of that's going to be in the north central U.S. through the Great Lakes and perhaps into New England. All the warmth will be pinned down into the southern part of the country. However, we're going to see a reversal of that as we get into the middle and late part of spring, so May and June. Warmth will expand during that period. The north-central part of the state will see that happen the slowest. The southwest will see it happen the fastest. So we have an early start to summer in the southwest U.S. with those above-normal temperatures noted. Precipitation, April looks to be pretty dry for the northern part of the country. We'll see wet anomalies and cross portions, areas near the Gulf Coast. That's the highest confidence, but some of that could expand maybe a little bit further north if the pattern is just right. But that break will not last too long as we see precipitation expand in the central and eastern part of the country for May and at least into June. And, that has implications for the flooding outlooks and everything else going ahead that Steve will talk about. But before we get there, let's wrap it all up into a graphic and into the northeast. You see a kind of a warmer pattern overall for the most part, with increased late spring storms. Be warm and humid in the southeast. Severe weather and flood risk will be elevated. Steve will cover that as well. South central U.S., active severe weather should be the highlight. But in the north central, increased late season rain, some enhanced river flooding. And northern Rockies, might be some snow left over in those areas. Northern high plains, we'll have to watch out for that. But in the west, warmer and drier will be the key. In the southwest, summer heat will arrive early. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Steve, who's going to bring it home and give us some more specific impacts of things that could happen this severe weather season.
Thanks, Nate, for taking us through that forecast. As you said here, we'll go ahead and take a look at some of those impacts of that forecast going forward here in different sectors for the next few months. So anyway, one aspect of the spring obviously is severe weather. And so here's a chart here that kind of shows the progression of the areas that typically see severe weather as we go through the April, May, and June timeframe. So you can see certainly in early April, severe weather tends to be focused kind of across the southern third of the country, Texas, Oklahoma, eastward across the southeast. But as we progress forward into May and June, you can see that those areas that typically see severe weather not only expand northward and eastward, but also kind of grow in probability as well. So you're much more likely to see severe weather in May and early June than you are during early April. And really by early June, pretty much the entire country east of the Rockies has a pretty high probability of seeing severe weather at some point during any given couple-week period of time. So certainly we're not quite to the peak of the severe weather season yet. We'll be getting there here in a few weeks, but obviously that will be a concern going forward here as we progress through the month of April. Now, so far to date, the plot on the left-hand side here shows all the actual occurrences of severe weather that we've seen across the U.S. The blue dots are areas that have seen severe wind gusts, the red dots, tornadoes, and the green dots, large hail. And you can see certainly that pretty much everything has been focused across the southeastern quadrants of the country. And that is the area that typically sees the most severe weather during the very early portion of the spring season. And again, that likely will be expanding westward and northward with time here as we progress forward for the next several weeks. In terms of actual tornado counts, we're pretty much running right at normal so far year to date. We've had 196, which is pretty much right about average for the last 10, 20, 30 years across a lot of the country. The chart on the right-hand side kind of shows a variety of years from recent times, kind of showing you what the possible ranges are as you go forward throughout the entire year. So we've seen some tremendous variability from year to year in severe weather. But one thing to kind of note, you can kind of see on some of these lines, there'll be a very sharp uptick, in the span of a short amount of time. And it's very common for a lot of the active years to actually have a lot of the severe weather concentrated in just a couple small sort of, 2 or 3 day outbreaks. And we had that happen last year especially. So a lot of times you may have a very quiet month and all of a sudden you have, 2 or 3 days where you just get, a couple hundred tornadoes. And so you can really dramatically change, kind of how the monthly average comes out just by one big event at any point in time. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Just because you have a long run of, very quiet weather doesn't really mean that you're going to end up, running below average throughout the entire spring season, since a lot of times the bulk of the activity just happens within a couple short bursts during, April or May or early June. Now, as we progress forward here, one thing also is this plot here from the CFS model, which kind of shows atmospheric instability as kind of a proxy for where severe weather may occur. And so it's showing from basically all of April through early May that the primary area for severe weather will tend to be focused across the plains to the western areas of the southeast and the western part of the Ohio Valley. Again, pretty typical for this time of the year, but also kind of shows that we may see a northward expansion of that severe weather with time across Nebraska and the Dakotas, and eventually up towards the Great Lakes as well as we progress forward towards late April and early May. So that's kind of the areas to kind of focus on for where we'll probably see the greatest amount of more intense severe weather going forward here during April and early May. Now, another aspect of the spring season every single year is the potential for spring flooding, because not only do we see a general increase in the amount of rainfall across the country, but we also typically still have snowfall that's on the ground that's melting and contributing more water to the rivers. And also another aspect of spring that you don't have in summer and the fall, at least early fall, is that in many areas vegetation is dormant, so you're not getting that water uptake by trees and plants and so forth. And so pretty much everything that falls is either going to go into the ground or run off. And so one thing we look at is how much snowfall we have on the ground and what we might be seeing in the coming days. And the plot on the left is a plot from the ECMWF forecast model showing the areas that will likely see snowfall for the next 10 days or so. So not really a whole lot across the central U.S., some snowfall for parts of the upper Midwest and parts of the Northeast, and obviously across the Rockies, they're still in their snow season there. But for the most part, no major widespread heavy snowfall events are going to really have a major impact on the outlook for the spring, at least changing it from what we have right now. Now, snow cover that we have right now on the ground is pretty limited, pretty much just across the Rockies. Some areas of the upper Midwest still have a few inches of water content in the snowpack across the eastern part of North Dakota and the upper part of Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and the UP and Michigan. So those areas are still going to be having some snow melt in the coming weeks that will contribute water mainly into the Red River of the areas between North Dakota and Minnesota, as well as also into the upper part of the Mississippi River Basin. So that will be draining southward with time as well, kind of adding to the water that's already there, which is still in many areas fairly high, kind of lingering from last year's levels, which saw widespread flooding. And that's kind of a lingering effect that we're seeing this year as well. So we kind of have everything primed, everything's already pretty high. And so any rain that we see or snow melt kind of helps to maintain or boost those levels even higher going forward here. Now, rainfall has actually been fairly light across the north-central U.S. the last several weeks, but certainly very heavy across the southeast. And the forecast for April, May, and June is a little bit deceiving here. We do see the forecast kind of favoring a drier than normal pattern across the northern half of the country, but a lot of that is in the near term, and we are looking to see a large part of the central and eastern U.S. actually be wetter than normal during the month of May. And May is typically the wettest month of the year for a lot of the plains and parts of the Midwest area. So that will be an area to look for, or a time to look for possibly the greatest impact of flooding, since we could be seeing not only our normal rainfall totals get higher, but also relative to normal, an increase as well. So we'll be looking for possibly a higher risk for flooding as we head into the month of May for many areas. Now, another aspect is the current soil moisture. Again, this is a lingering factor from last year, which saw all the record rainfall and flooding across the central U.S. We still have very high soil moisture across the plains and most of the Midwest and even the southeast now. And so the aspect that's kind of important with that is that if the soil moisture is very high, you just can't really absorb as much water into the ground when we do see a heavy rainfall event. And so the bulk of the rain that does fall tends to run off right into the river basins. And so that will be a factor to watch going forward as well. And likely that won't change a whole lot, even if we do see a drier than normal April, because again, at this time of the year, we don't have a lot of moisture uptake from vegetation yet. And so it's really hard to dry out the ground during April unless you're extremely hot and everything really gets growing a lot earlier than normal. And so that wet soil should continue throughout April. And then again, once the rainfall does increase in intensity and coverage during late April and May, that soil moisture will still be high and the rainfall will be increasing. And that will again be the time period that could see our greatest flood potential across the rivers of the central U.S. Now, looking back at last year, the plot on the left-hand side shows for the same day the areas that had flooding at this time of March. And the purple dots indicated major flooding, the red dots where we had, moderate flooding, and then the other color is just minor flooding. And then what we ended up with at our peak level on the right-hand side, you can see all those purple dots indicated where we saw major flooding, and a lot of those were actually record flooding as well. And so a large part of the central U.S., pretty much, half of the Missouri River Basin had major flooding, and most of the Mississippi River Basin had major flooding as well. And if we skip ahead to what we have in place this year, there is still some areas that do have flooding going on right now, but not nearly to the extent that we had at this point in time last year. And part of that is because we had a lot of snow cover last year at this time that was melting off, kind of enhancing the overall moisture input into the rivers. So not as bad at this point this year compared to last year. And the forecast map on the right kind of shows what we could be seeing going forward here. Again, still many areas the Red River, the Missouri River, and parts of the Mississippi could be seeing some major flooding still potentially this spring. Again, a lot of it just depends on how the rainfall, kind of occurs. You can get the same amount of rainfall but spread it out over 5 weeks and not get the same amount of flooding as you would if all that rain came within, say, a 1-week time period. So the distribution of rainfall will be very important, obviously, going forward as well, but certainly with the soil moisture being very high, rivers already being, high to, in some cases, a little bit above flood stage in many areas. If we do see any heavy rainfall events this spring, flooding will happen very quickly across the rivers of the central U.S. But overall, we're not quite at the levels that we were last year, so we're not looking to see the same level of extensive flooding that we saw last year, but still, it will be a concern going forward. Now, drought conditions obviously are not a concern for the central U.S. with that high soil moisture that is already in place, but we have had a drier than normal winter across parts of the western U.S., especially California, and so drought has already been expanding along the west coast so far this year, and that likely will continue. Obviously, we're getting towards the end of the rainy season for that part of the country, so likely we are going to be seeing an expansion of drought as we head into the drier part of the year coming up here later in spring and into summer. Now, another aspect of the dryness there, of course, is the potential for wildfires. We certainly have had some incredible wildfires across the West in recent years, and so the fact that we have some dryness expanding right now already, before we even get into the summer season, does increase the risk there. So now here is a plot on this page here showing the average threat areas for wildfires for March and April on the left, and then May and June on the right-hand side. And you can see certainly, typically the highest threat area at this time of the year is across the southeastern U.S., but it really varies dramatically year to year there because some winters are very dry, some winters are very wet like this past year was. So this year we have a lot of moisture in place, but some years can be very dry there. And also at this time of the year, before a lot of the grass and trees have sort of leafed out and started growing, you have a lot of dormant vegetation that can burn easily, even if you do have, fairly wet ground conditions. So a few warm days with a lot of wind and dormant grasses can catch on fire, quite readily, even when you do have higher soil moisture at this time of the year. But typically, you'll see those areas there kind of subside as the spring season progresses and everything greens up and you get more rainfall. But you can see across California, typically the threat there for fire increases steadily as you go from March through June, and obviously it continues to increase further as you head through the dry season there during the summer parts of the year. So again, with the dryness there, that will be a concern going forward through the later part of the spring and especially into summer and next fall. Now, the wildfire outlook in the near term, again, does have a higher probability of fire across California there, where we do have those drought conditions kind of developing. Again, the threat this time of year is not that high relative to, say, later in summer and fall, but certainly relative to what we normally see this time of year, it is above average. Certainly across the southeast, where we have had some very heavy rainfall for the last several months, everything is really saturated, so it's going to be very hard to see any significant fires develop in those areas here the next couple of months. Now, before we kind of wrap up here, a quick look at the possibilities for tropical activity to get going here in the early part of the hurricane season. Typically, we don't see the season start until, June, but about every other year we see a tropical storm get going before June 1st, which is the traditional start of the hurricane season. And so this year, one thing we're looking at is the fact that we do have warm water in place across the Gulf and much of the Atlantic Basin. And the map on the left-hand side there shows the forecast SST anomalies for the June through August period based on the CFS model, again showing that warmth likely will persist across the Gulf and most of the Atlantic Basin. And obviously, if the water is warmer than normal, you kind of reach that magical 80-degree threshold a little bit earlier in the year than typical, and it does help to get those early season storms a little bit more of a boost. And the other thing we look for is wind shear, and so the blue areas indicate areas that we could see lower than average wind shear. And lower wind shear and warmer water typically are the ingredients you want to have if you want to see hurricane development take place. So we'll be watching that pretty closely here going forward. Odds are kind of favorable at this point in time that we could potentially see an early season storm get going in the Gulf or somewhere in the western Atlantic before the start of the hurricane season. So it wouldn't be surprising to see a storm in May develop somewhere in that area and possibly threaten the coast. Typically, though, storms that do develop during May or any time in the late spring, early summer period are not typically very, very strong, and so the risk for a major hurricane at that point in time is fairly low. But here from the ECMWF model, you can kind of get an idea also where tropical activity may take place in the early part of the season. This is just showing rainfall forecasts, but you can use that to kind of as a proxy for where tropical activity may take place. And so that brown area there across parts of the Caribbean kind of indicates you may not see a lot of activity there during the early part of the summer. But there's some hints of kind of greens right around Florida and the coast of the southeast. So we could possibly see some storms develop very close to the U.S. in the early part of the season. So we'll have to watch that closely. Again, as we head through May into June, that risk will start to increase. And so it wouldn't be surprising to see a storm develop early this year in those areas. So overall, we do see a slightly elevated risk for tropical activity during the early part of the season across the northern Gulf and the western Atlantic close to the southeast. So that would be the main area to focus on, and somewhat of a reduced risk for the early part of the season across much of the Caribbean based on the current outlook. Now let's take a few looks at some of the various industries specifically. So first off here is a look at the energy industry impacts for the upcoming spring season. So in the energy industry, some possible weather impacts this spring are going to be the fact that we are going to be seeing a warmer than normal temperature pattern across the southern and the western U.S., and so those areas could be seeing some early cooling demand get going here in the next couple of months, especially across the southwest, which could see 90s in Phoenix a little bit earlier than average this year. And at the same time, we may see a period of above normal heating demand across the central U.S. during April, especially the middle part of the month, which may be a little bit more favorable to see a couple of rounds of colder weather in those areas. So we'll be watching for that. But for the most part, other than that mid-April time period, which could see a little bit of cold, the bulk of the U.S. likely will be skewed towards the warmer than the average side of things for most of the upcoming spring season. Again, I mentioned the possibility for some early season heat across the southwest, so that will be a concern there. And then any lingering coolness across the north central U.S. really should kind of evaporate by the end of April. We are looking for most of the country to be warmer than normal during May, so May will likely see stronger than average cooling demand across the vast bulk of the country. So now looking at some transportation impacts based on the upcoming spring, we are looking to see, again, the main impact in transportation be on the potential for flooding on riverways across the central U.S., so not only the Missouri, but the Mississippi as well, and possibly parts of the western Ohio Valley could be looking at flooding potential, especially, again, by the month of May. And the heavy rains that we do see already in place across the southeast will just tend to periodically boost flooding levels across those areas as well. So the Tennessee Valley will probably go back and forth between flooding and less flooding as these periods of rain kind of move through that region. But certainly a continued threat for flooding across the southeast going forward here. In the early spring snows, we may see continue across the north central U.S. here. Again, the ECMWF plot I showed a few slides back did show some threat for additional snowfall across those areas. And again, through the middle of April, we could see some additional rounds of snow, mainly across the Dakotas, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, possibly some of the western high plains areas as well at that time, but obviously kind of limited to those far north central portions of the country. So looking at aviation impacts this spring, we are looking at potentially, again, a more active severe weather pattern across the central and eastern U.S. potentially as we head through the spring season, especially from late April through May. And so that will be the main time period to look for possibly severe weather impacting airports or other flight issues. Also, again, spring snowfalls across the north central U.S. may be an issue for areas up there during the middle part of April especially. And then another thing is we are going to be looking at a stronger than average jet stream across much of the southern and the eastern U.S. as we progress through the spring season. That likely will be kind of a persistent factor for much of the season, and so higher than average wind speeds across those areas aloft at flight level, impacting flight plans, and then also that will tend to be areas that also see more turbulence than average as well. So we'll be watching for possibly the southeastern U.S. seeing more turbulence issues as we head through the spring season. Now, looking at marine impacts this spring, again, the potential does exist that we could see an early season tropical event take place sometime during the month of May or early June across the Gulf of Mexico or possibly the far western Atlantic, kind of around Florida or off the coast of the southeast. So those will be the areas to watch for possible tropical activity impacts as we head through the latter part of the spring season. Again, tropical or thunderstorm activity in general will be occurring throughout May along the Gulf Coast areas, so that likely will be sort of an above-average sort of pattern that continues. We've seen a lot of activity at times recently, and that should kind of persist really right on through the spring season. We will likely see a northward shift as we head through May, with more of the activity kind of shifting farther north into the continental U.S., but really, overall, we should still see an above-average amount of thunderstorm activity along the Gulf Coast during May. And then we are seeing overall weaker than average wind speeds along the Gulf Coast this spring. At the surface, it may be windier than average aloft, but at the surface, lower than average wind speeds likely this spring. And so we are looking to see a near average end to the fog season for many of the port areas there, like around Houston and so forth, going forward during the remainder of the spring season. Now, certainly outdoor safety can be an impact as well, with severe weather increasing across the central and eastern U.S. as we head through the spring season. So the main impacts this spring on outdoor safety for sports and so forth, assuming that we actually are able to get back to those here eventually later on this spring season, will be the fact that, again, May in particular is looking to be a very active severe weather month. So we may see a lot of issues with severe weather impacting outdoor events during the month of May. Also, we are going to be seeing an early season start to the hotter weather across the Southwest and the South in general. So we may see more days with not only higher heat, but higher humidity. And that's one thing that will be a factor not only this spring, but really throughout the entire summer season, is a high humidity across the southern part of the country. And also many areas of the eastern half of the U.S. may experience a more active rainfall pattern in general during May, which may impact sort of a wide range of events. So to wrap things up here, again, we are looking for the potential for a cooler than average central U.S. during April, and then generally a warmer pattern developing as we head through May and June across the U.S. And again, May looks to be, again, the highlight for severe weather and rainfall across a good portion of the country. So overall, again, we are looking at a fairly active spring season, with temperatures getting potentially pretty hot as we head through the end of the spring. And so with that, we'll open things up to questions. I guess, Nate and Jeff, have you seen any questions roll in that we can try to answer for everybody before we have to wrap things up here in about 10 minutes?
Well, a couple of questions. Let me start by reading off the first one. I noticed that some of the guidance shows the risk of La Nina towards the end of spring. If that were to occur, what would that mean for the forecast?
Well, I can take a stab at that. One of the things that La Nina tends to do in the spring is cause more active severe weather, but usually we want to have that in place through the spring as opposed to it developing later on into the summer season. Another factor that comes in with the La Nina, especially summer and into the fall, would be more extensive drought conditions and large-scale dryness. And our current forecast is showing that tendency to develop over the western part of the country through the spring and into the summer, so expanding drought. And if that La Nina would get going this summer, I could see that dryness expanding eastward later into the summer, possibly into the plains, and then into the fall season, maybe becoming a little more expansive as well. But as far as the spring season goes, the main effect would be to enhance the severe weather, and since we're already going for that, I don't think we'll probably see too much of a difference if La Nina started just a little bit earlier than we're expecting.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Great information. Next question up is, if we were to see an early season tropical system show up in, let's say, late May or June, does that necessarily mean that we'll have an active tropical season overall?
I guess I'll go ahead and answer that one. Sorry if anybody else is jumping in there. In general, no, it does not. I mean, typically, we do look at patterns like this where we see a lot of warmth in the Atlantic Basin in general and lower wind shear, which typically promotes an active season overall. But there's not really a lot of correlation between what happens in May and what happens during the remainder of the season, since a lot of times there's a lot of change that takes place in terms of patterns between May and the heart of the hurricane season during August, September, and October.
Fantastic points there. Thank you very much. The next one up, can you talk a little bit about Great Lakes flooding potential? I think I'll take that one. Now, you do notice when we look back at some of the slides that showed snowpack, portions of the northern Great Lakes, and especially the eastern Great Lakes, still have some snow on the ground. And water levels across the Great Lakes have been running, on average, above normal, at least the last few years, and this year is no exception. So the with that in mind, it does make any event maybe a little bit more impactful than the next. But looking at precipitation estimates, especially as you go to the western Great Lakes, with that drier weather, it does sort of take away from the potential a little bit, especially compared to last year. But any one event that occurs, especially if you get any sort of heavy rain that occurs at a single moment, and all the rivers, everything that drain into the Great Lakes occur, that actually happens, then yeah, short-lived Great Lakes flooding events will be possible. Especially it'll be true towards the eastern Great Lakes, as most of the Great Lakes do drain into the smaller eastern Great Lakes as we go forward. And it's hard for the St. Lawrence River to drain all that water out of there, especially with the above normal water levels that are in place as it is. So, yeah, there's a little enhanced potential for Great Lakes flooding, but it should not be as widespread as what occurred in the eastern Great Lakes last year. All right, last one up. What types of things can happen that would make the severe weather season less active than what we're anticipating for large portions of the country?
Well, one of the things that could happen to reduce that would be if we had the storm track stay way to the south and allow considerable amount of cold air to come in, drier air. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. We're going to see some dryness during the month of April, so that'll somewhat cut down on the severe weather, but it looks like the pattern for May is going to return to something that's a little wetter, more active. So chances of the severe season dropping off this year do appear to be slim based on the pattern that's shaping up right now.
All right, thank you, Jeff. And we got one more question here. We have seen an unusually strong Arctic oscillation through the winter and early spring, positive AO. What are your thoughts on that continuing through the spring and into the summer?
Yeah, I guess I can handle that one. Yeah, we certainly have seen a record strong polar vortex, which has led to a very strong, persistent positive AO. We are seeing the polar vortex actually warm right now and weaken, and now typically it does anyway during the spring season, and so that should have an impact on the Arctic oscillation as well. So likely we'll see it trend more neutralish going forward. The impacts, though, do vary a lot between winter and summer with a positive and negative AO. So you can actually have a negative AO in the summer and see widespread heat across the U.S. because the jet stream itself has shifted so far north that the impacts can kind of actually reverse with time. And so obviously during the spring season, a negative AO would still promote cold across the U.S. So we'll have to watch that and see if we do see a weakening of the AO and possibly a negative shift as we head forward in time here. Most likely, though, the persistent strong positive AO will diminish going forward here the way it looks right now through the balance of the spring and summer. How it evolves later in the year is hard to say, but at this point, I don't think we're going to see it persist in a strong manner going forward here, beyond the near term.
All right, thank you very much, and I think we have run out of time for questions as we are very near the top of the hour.
Yeah, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up now since we are at the top of the hour and our hour of time here is pretty much up. So thanks again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day and stay safe. Bye.